Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. So today I'm with Joanna Czutkowna, consultant, doctoral researcher, specialising in circularity within sports apparel. And today we're going to talk about sustainability with a focus on sports kit. So hi Jo, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. We are on our second recording today because something went wrong. So I hugely appreciate you coming back on. So we won't lie to anybody. This is the second go, so it should be perfect today.
Fingers crossed. That's what we're hoping.
We're hoping so. So can you provide our listeners with a bit of a background to yourself before we start?
Yep. So my background is in fashion. So I always feel like a bit of an imposter, the fashion girl that's entered into sport. But I've spent 20 years in the fashion industry, 10 years based out in China, really working on innovation, on procurement, everything from the design process all the way through to manufacture and retailing. And very much on the ground in factories, seeing what it's like. So yeah, I've kind of taken that experience, and we know that there's a lot of problems in terms of the fashion space, but a lot of those carry over into sport because the amount of apparel that's in sport. So that's what I do now within my consultancy. So I'm CEO of 5 Thread, and we help fashion, sports, and education sectors to really change the game in what they're doing.
And at the same time, you're doing a PhD?
I am also doing a PhD, in circularity and football shirts, mainly because there's just so much scope within sports to look at this and look at circular economy and really change the game as saying how we're doing things and look at those circular economy business models like rental, resale, digital experiences.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm sure we're going to hear some great things about fashion and about sport. We've done a number of podcasts in the past where we've talked about, the issues that are caused by climate change on sport and the impact that sport is having on climate change. So we're not going to dig into many of those. But I did think it'd be interesting to just talk a little bit about sustainability, because all the podcasts we've spoken about are really about environmental sustainability. And here we're touching on a little bit more than just environmental. I say just, that's probably a bad term to use, but we're talking in the broader sense. So can you just give us a bit of a brief background into your understanding of sustainability?
Yes, well, I'm laughing about this because in my PhD, we have to define what sustainability is. And so I've been on quite a journey with this, and there's over 300 definitions around what sustainability is. And, the long and short of it is it's an oxymoron. It means so many different things. And to be honest, it lacks true meaning anymore. But for me personally, I always think of it in terms of the 3 pillars, which is people, planet, and profit. So social, are we ethical and fair in how we treat our supply chains, for example? Economic, can you afford to continue running your business? And environmental. So, we have to be realistic that those 3 pillars don't exist in isolation, and they can be in conflict with each other. And it's really interesting. I know we were doing a lecture last week when we asked, what should be a company's priority? Is it environmental or is it economic? And there's quite a split there. And I would say a lot of companies still prioritize economic sustainability over environmental. And I think even less companies look at social sustainability. So I think it's quite complex. I think it's surrounded by greenwashing now. To a customer, sustainability has so many different meanings. So to me, I kind of look about the circular economy and certain different frameworks in terms of how can we practically take these ideas forward.
And the people, planet, profit side of things has been around for a little while now. And it does seem like people are starting to think about all 3 of those now, whereas before, and there's probably still many that are, profit was first in a lot of people's thinking. It'd be interesting to see how that may change. And I know you briefly mentioned it in the lecture you delivered for me recently, but I think it's in the UEFA report that I've seen recently. Talking about, I've always found this strange that everybody just talks about growth and continuous growth and continuously more profit. And I think there's a quote in there somewhere that says, anybody who thinks you can just continue to grow and have more on a planet with limited resources I think it says something like, is either deranged or an economist, I think is what it says, which I find quite funny. But I think that needs to start to change mindsets around things. And I think I wanted to really set the scene there around people, planet, profit, because I think it really opens up the conversation that we're going to have. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say exactly. I think we are living in a cost of living crisis, and there's a lot of brands that are just focused now on increased profits and driving growth. You know, if you look at Nike, they grew 1%. They didn't feel that growth was strong enough, and they've cut almost half their workforce. But like you say from that quote, it is ridiculous to think that we continue in this way and it's not going to cause problems for the climate. So how can we look at different models compared to this linear business model that we're on and actually look at circular economy business models? So that's kind of what I'm quite passionate about, because I do think there needs to be significant change in the way that we do things.
Definitely. So, to get us going in terms of this, can you talk us through the fashion industry and kind of the problems there? We've all heard problems, but can you highlight them to us?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like where do we start with this? It's the fourth most damaging sector, you know, not just for emissions, but also for things like chemicals and water. Global textile production doubled between 2000 and 2015. So we're making more clothes, but we're using them for almost half as long. The amount of time that we wear our clothes has decreased by 36% in the last 15 years. You know, only 1% of clothing is actually recycled into new clothing. So there's a myth about, you know, we're going to recycle our way out of this. The recycling infrastructure isn't scaled at the moment to be able to facilitate it. And 73% of materials are sent to landfill or incinerated at the end of life. So there's massive problems within the fast fashion space that are only continuing to get worse as we kind of perpetuate this business model of selling more at lower prices.
Yeah, and we're all probably guilty of taking on more and more clothes and cheap clothes and not recycling. But the interesting point there is around as well us giving things to charity and trying to recycle, because we probably think we're doing things for the better for everybody, and we are to an extent. But can you give us some information around that in terms of charity shops? Because I know we mentioned this before.
Yeah, so only about 30% of what we give to charity actually gets sold in that charity shop. And it actually costs the charity shop quite a lot of money to sort through all of the garments that we give them, because so many of them are waste. But what tends to happen is that the 70% that are not sold in that store basically are sorted then and graded by quality, and then they are then shipped to secondary markets. One of the biggest markets is in Ghana, called Kantamanto Market. 15 million items are received by that market every week. And about 40%, you know, figures vary, but about 40% of everything that they receive is waste. And so what happens when a trader kind of goes to buy that stock is it's all baled up. So they only buy a closed bale. They can't see what's inside of it. And then they open it up, and 40% of that bale they might not be able to use. And so they have to pay to discard that. And we're getting to a point where the landfills are full, the waterways are contaminated, but we continue to still produce very fast fashion and use this as a way of disposal. But actually, there's a lot of people who are just saying that this is waste colonialism now. And we're also finding problems with things like illegal dumping. So in Chile, there were 39,000 tons of clothing dumped in the desert, because if they took them over the border, they would have to pay the tariffs. Now it's about 60,000 tons, and it's so big that you can see it from space. So we're literally kind of running out of places to put this product now. You know, there is no way for it because most of it is made from polyester. It doesn't biodegrade. You know, it can be harmful when it's burnt. So it's a huge issue, but because it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, and we're shipping it abroad, we're not really feeling the repercussions essentially in this country.
And when you mentioned this to me before, so I obviously had to go and Google it. And you know, anybody listening now, go and Google the Chile. You can see the pictures of where this has been dumped in the desert. So it was astonishing to me when I first heard that. So I really wanted to touch upon that again. Now, how is the sports industry contributing to this? I know you've mentioned to me you're the fashion girl who's now in the sports industry, and I think there's a reason you've moved to research this industry specifically. So can you give us some of that? Why did you research back into this industry, and how is it impacting?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was very unexpected, as PhDs do. It went from looking at kind of digital supply chains into cricket initially. And I kind of realized how much kit and equipment is used in sports and how underutilized that is. And so from that, I've just become fascinated with it, because when we've looked at the stats, for example, if we take football, 60% of professional football kit is never used and is actually just destroyed even before it's ever worn. So if you think about that from an environmental and economic point of view, it just doesn't make any sense. And then if you put some values to that, that's about 1.5 to 3.5 million items per season, which is massive. And financially, it's about 108 million euros, which is being lost and basically set on fire each season. And that's equivalent to transfer fees of somebody like Jude Bellingham. So there's huge issues in sports. Football fascinates me particularly because it's the idea of having this garment that is so interconnected with a club, the history and heritage of a club. It's got huge emotional value. You have such unique experiences wearing that shirt. But then also the club releases a new kit every season. So the shelf life of that shirt is about 10 months now. And it's not just one shirt, it's your home, away, and third kit. And now you have things like special editions. So there's more and more kind of inventory being added to the retail arm of this. And we're seeing more kind of fashion and sports collaborations. So Reiss recently partnered with McLaren and they released a range. And we're seeing more things like that. We're seeing athletes becoming ambassadors for the luxury brands, for example. And that is just facilitating this idea of more and more consumption and more growth within apparel for sports.
Let me just jump on a couple of things you said there. So you talked about the planet and we're talking about profit. And I know you're really keen to get this message across that actually you can still be profitable through a circular business model and stopping this waste. So there's a big incentive on the profit side to do this. But one of the things that stood out when I've spoke to you about this before, and you said there, it gets incinerated. I had assumed that it's the same thing as you mentioned in Africa, another place that we just send it away and pretend it's not our problem. But it doesn't just get sent away. Some of this is incinerated in this country as well, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's quite a normal practice, and some people would argue it's a circular practice because you're extracting energy from burning that waste. I think there's parts of Sweden that basically run on the burning of clothes. One of the retailers basically disposes of it in that way. So it's a massive problem. But the reason why it's done is to protect the linear business model. Because if you have all of this excess stock and you can't do anything with it, you need to get rid of it. Otherwise, it will devalue that brand. And the interesting thing is that the EU has become very strong on this. So there's the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, and they are proposing a ban on the destruction of unsold goods. So it's going to be really interesting to see how clubs and brands adapt to that. If you can't now burn your stock, what are you going to do with it? So I'm really interested to see how they adapt. And there are circular business models that can support you with this. So if we look at upcycling, for example, there's a company called FC88. They will take the product and they'll retain the value of that product. So it could be the badge, for example, and they will turn it into a unique item. They might turn it into a laptop sleeve or a rucksack or something like that. But they will cut around things like outdated sponsors so that the embargoes that some of the brands have on reuse don't exist because they'll only use parts of the shirt that they can salvage. So I think it is about being commercial. I started life off as a buyer and I'm very much in favor that people need to have economic sustainability. But I think there are ways that you can do this that don't have such a damaging impact on the planet.
And there's lots of us who can be involved in making a difference here. And I think we're going to talk through that a little bit now. So you mentioned governments and legislations coming in. But what are UEFA doing? UEFA have been quite forward thinking really in what they're doing. So could you talk us through a little bit of UEFA and specifically around the kits and what they're doing?
Yep. So last year, UEFA released their circular economy guidelines for apparel. In my opinion, they were a leader in this space because one of the first ones to actually address that conflict of interest in apparel and kit. The football apparel sector is worth 113.5 billion. Now, UEFA, within their circular economy guidelines, suggested a 4R hierarchy in terms of reduce, reuse, and recycle and then recover. So to go out to their 55 national associations and suggest that we actually start to reduce the amount of kit and apparel that we have in our ranges, I think was a really bold step. And within those guidelines, they have a range of different suggestions in terms of cost levels and complexities where clubs can kind of meet them where they're at. So rather than having to invest in quite costly solutions, there's some quite easy things that clubs can start to implement. And I think that's really important that we all start to kind of make changes wherever we can. And one of the big things, one of the examples was Brentford, is that they just didn't release a kit for one season. They missed a home season kit launch. And the reason why they did that was mainly because of the cost of living crisis. They said we didn't want to put that pressure on fans. we felt like fans should have more longevity from that shirt, and the byproduct was sustainability. And I think that's a brilliant way to deliver the message. It doesn't always have to be the environmental good. It can be for economic reasons.
It's a good example with that life cycle. I think from what I just read earlier, they've now got 9 R's from what I saw. And I saw the first one was refuse, which I thought was quite interesting. Are they talking from a perspective of, refuse items because manufacturers are doing X, Y, and Z, or are they talking about fans refusing to buy things? What was their message there with the refuse element?
Yeah, I mean, within the circular economy, there is a 9R hierarchy. UEFA decided to use 4, to make it easier for stakeholders to understand. But the first one is, of course, refuse. And for me, just as somebody who engages with sport, it's things like, if you're going to do a race, just refuse to have a race t-shirt unless you're going to really wear it and love it and get a lot of emotional value from it. Just refuse that. There's a lot of kit that we give away. There's a lot of excess kit out there that nobody's asked for, but you just kind of get by default. And I think one of the key things is you can just start to kind of say no to that. And I think that's a big thing, especially with merchandise and branding and sponsorship. There's a lot of sponsors who will want to give things away. Everybody loves a freebie, but I think it's about actually saying, let's stop. Let's really consider if that's the right thing to do. And if we are going to do that, let's think about how we're going to design it so it can be taken back, it can be reused, and that it's just not a single-use plastic item that is given out to hundreds of thousands of fans, for example. So a lot of it is just about really considering the product that we put out there and thinking, is there a smarter way to do this? The circular economy is really about how do we decouple growth from finite resources. Digital is a way that you could do that, for example. So I think if we look at how we can do it and lean into that, there are a lot of innovative solutions that we can consider.
And in terms of clubs, it's interesting for them and their understanding. They're obviously on this start of this journey, really. And I know people talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. I wonder if we could just touch up on what they are and how clubs might start to become a bit more aware of scope 3 emissions, because this might turn into something where they start refusing to work with brands or work with manufacturers and put the pressure on from that way.
Exactly. So your scope 1 emissions are your direct emissions, which are kind of owned and controlled by you as a company. Your scope 2 and 3 are almost like indirect emissions. Scope 2 are, I would say, easier to monitor and to collect because they're kind of purchased from things like your electricity, things like that. Whereas scope 3 is essentially the emissions caused throughout your supply chain. They're indirect emissions. And so I think it was Man City who was saying about 87% of their emissions are from scope 3. Now, scope 3 is really difficult to manage and to collect because, for example, if you have kit that is made in China, you need to understand, what does that factory power their manufacturing with? Is it a renewable energy? Is it coal, for example? Which factory is it made in? Where is the fiber coming from? Where is the fabric being manufactured? So you need to have such transparency through that supply chain to be able to quantify those emissions within scope 3. And we've talked about complex supply chains before. I don't think that's always the case that you can achieve that. But I think it's really about leaning into partnerships with your suppliers and understanding how can we measure and monitor our emissions together almost, and incentivizing them in terms of why it's important, especially when you're dealing with global supply chains.
Yeah, it does sound very difficult to do. I think from what I could perceive, it seemed like, well, scope 1, we understand that and we can measure that. So scope 3 historically was like, we don't know about that, so we don't take much notice. Whereas now it seems like we're starting to actually open our eyes a little bit and make some changes happen. Do you think that's coming from some legislation that's further down the line that may be coming? Are people getting ahead of the curve?
I hope so. I think it's coming from sport's greater awareness of its role within climate change. Sport's part of the solution, but part of the problem. And it has more eyes on it than ever before. So I think it is having to step up to that responsibility. In regards to apparel, I think it will be driven by legislation. I think there are some fashion retailers who have really future-proofed themselves, but it's an unlevel playing field at the moment because the legislation is not yet enforced. Whereas I think when that does come into force over the next couple of years, they will have to consider things like extended producer responsibility. So taking responsibility for the full life cycle of that product, They'll have to look at things like eco-design, so making better products, that could be repaired or recycled or that are more durable, for example. And having an understanding of your supply base and how products are made and where the emissions fall and how you can monitor and reduce those emissions is fundamental. So I think it will come as things like data collection become better and better. And I know UEFA released their carbon footprint calculator the other week. Tools like that will help clubs be able to track more accurately. But I think it's also that relationship between club, brand, and manufacturer that needs to be strengthened, because at the moment it is very opaque. Clubs don't necessarily know where their product is made. And then, only this week, I think it was FC Barcelona actually talked about making their own kit. Maybe we should cut Nike out of this process and actually manufacture our own kit in Spain. So there's also a lot of changes there in terms of where does the responsibility lie? At the moment, the club essentially buys the product from the brand, but could the club actually become a manufacturer? And I think legislation is interesting because when you talk about extended producer responsibility, the onus there is on, I guess, the producer. But who is that producer? Is it the club? Is it the brand? Is it the manufacturer? So those responsibilities I don't think are clear at the moment. Neither are the repercussions.
That's a really interesting question with so many parts to it. Like talking about the life cycle. Firstly, who owns that life cycle is really interesting. I was thinking there, if Barcelona produced their own kit, my first thought was, how are they going to distribute that around the world? I mean, Nike would distribute things much more easily than Barcelona in my head. And then I started thinking about this life cycle and who owns it and who understands it, I suppose. So I think those early parts of sustainability and thinking about things, everybody started thinking, well, packaging, it's coming loads of plastic, let's stop that. People have then started to think about distribution a little bit, traveling, or has it been flown, or those kind of areas. But that's only a small part really of that life cycle. So raw materials, where has this come from? We could touch upon this. So in terms of what kits are made from, what is a good solution? Because should everything be made from cotton? What's the issues with polyester? So what are those? What's the best source of raw material?
And this is a question I get asked most frequently. I mean, polyester is derived from oil. It's essentially a plastic. There is recycled polyester, and a lot of clubs now do use that, but that tends to be derived from plastic bottles. And there are questions over how those plastic bottles are collected. Are they collected in an ethical way? Are the workers who collect them paid fair wages, for example? And we've also found scenarios where new plastic bottles are being made just to melt down into chips to be able to produce recycled polyester.
That just sounds bizarre. So that is actually happening.
There's been cases where that's happened. And also the problem is that recycled polyester at the moment is at a premium compared to virgin polyester. So it may cost you more. It's not a perfect scenario. What we want to get to is this idea of textile to textile recycling. As I say, only 1% of used clothes are actually made into new textiles at the moment. But Puma has launched for next season a program where it will make all its replica shirts from textile to textile recycling. Now, some of the materials that are used for this are actually pre-consumer waste. So they're off the factory floor. So they're cutting waste, for example, and that is easier to use because it's not contaminated. It's a mono material, for example. So we do see moves towards this, and I think Puma's leading in this way, but there's still a lot of way to go. And I would say there's no perfect material. Cotton, even though it might be better at the end of life because it can potentially biodegrade, it's a very thirsty crop. So it uses a lot of water. So for me, the most perfect material is the one that you already own. It's the garment that you have in your wardrobe, rather than us continuing to talk about sustainable brands and what's a great brand that I can buy from. Actually look at what you have already, because that's the best thing that you can do, is wear and use the clothes that you have in your wardrobe. Buy one shirt by all means, but continue to wear that shirt to every game, across seasons. You don't need to buy a new shirt every season. That's the most sustainable thing that you can do.
I think this is a good message. It's interesting with kids and that message. I'm not trying to have a get out of jail free card for kids here, but being a parent and thinking about, do you put them in the latest kit, or can you buy a kit that would last longer? So as a football fan, I can buy a shirt that lasts quite a long time. If it's not necessarily this year's shirt, you can have a polo shirt that's got your club on or something like that and do something different. So that's just me thinking out loud of ways I could look at doing things differently for my kids, so I'm not having to buy a shirt every year or whatever, or not trying not to feel that pressure to do that.
And I think it is super hard. I've got 2 kids, but, there are circular business models that we could lean into. One could be club driven. So they could have a rental model where you could actually rent it for one season, and as the child grows, then you kind of give that back and they can rent another one next season. But there are also resale platforms that specialize in kids and sportswear. Kidda 3R is one of them. So think about actually, could you buy this already used? I know that can be complex when people start to put names and numbers on the back because it personalizes it. But I would say there's a huge amount of pressure on parents already. A shirt is very expensive. I know parents sometimes can't afford the official shirt, so then they end up buying a counterfeit one, and that causes more problems for the club longer term. So I think it's really about leaning into those circular economy business models, this reusing and resharing of shirts, across potentially different classes within schools. There are ways that you can do this. And we see this with fashion. There's a company called The Little Loop who were on Dragon's Den, who started a rental model for children's wear that have been very successful. And what they do is actually, when the product can no longer be rented, they resell that product at a lower price. Circular business models are estimated to be worth 700 billion by 2030. So it can be hugely profitable. We just have to think differently about how we get the value within the use phase of that life cycle.
We've talked a lot there about more professional side of sport. I'm just thinking out loud really about grassroots sport. When I was younger, our teams shared the kit. We would have a kit and we'd pass it down to the team below, passed it down to the team below. And, I coach a grassroots football team, and they have actually recently launched a sustainability policy. And I think things will be moving forward. But it does very much seem like a lot of people want to have a new kit at least every couple of years. And it doesn't seem that systematic in terms of passing a kit down to other generations. Whereas when I was younger, and it was probably more of whether it was a people thing, whether it was an economic type thing, we shared that kit. We wore it. A few years later, somebody else would get it. And I remember walking along once and seeing my old team playing and going, that's our kit. And it must have been 10 years after we'd worn it. So it does seem a little bit like we've moved backwards in a sense from where we used to be with sharing, and whether it be car sharing or passing football boots on to people. It seems like now we are a bit more consumer driven and we don't naturally do this as much, and we really need to try and bring it back.
100%. I think overconsumption has become the norm. And as global manufacturing's got cheaper, it is very affordable to be able to buy kit, and it almost comes as standard when you join as some grassroots clubs. It wasn't so long ago that you'd have a shared kit bag, and you would just normally hand things down and share them. I think we need to normalize that. Leaders and managers within grassroots need to facilitate it and create systems where that makes it easier than actually buying new, rather than kind of saying, when you join us, we'll give you a free shirt. Actually look at how you can facilitate that across your different teams. But yeah, I mean, we've spoken about before, my dad laughs at me in terms of circular economy, because to him, it's just, old-fashioned common sense. You would use the item for as long as you could until it basically fell apart, and then you would try and repair it. And only when you could no longer repair it would you harvest those components and try and salvage the components from it. But that's just not normal now for us. We've got to a state where actually, we're just driven by newness. And I think we just really need to take a step back and actually have a think about whether that's sensible, especially with the issues that we're facing within the climate and environment.
Just thinking there, when I was younger, and hopefully I'm not embarrassing myself here, but putting a patch on a pair of trousers, or was it called darning? Am I making that word up?
Yeah.
My grandma would do that. I mean, putting a patch on, I could probably do that, but darning, I have no idea how to do this. So this seems like we've lost the skill to do some of these things, or the time, or we've got more money and we can afford to do these things. But how do we try and bring those things back?
I mean, to me, it starts with education. One of the sectors that we work with is the education sector. And when we've worked with schools, especially around textiles, they tell us that actually it takes them much longer now to teach the physical skills of, say, quilting or sewing, because of the dexterity of the handwork of the students. A lot of the students want to be told what to do and get it right first time. So I think there's a real gap in the practical skills, and that we need to teach those through education. And I think we've also prioritized more academic learning than we have in terms of skills-based learning. To me, I feel like there are issues with the education system in terms of people coming out not being prepared for the world of work in the next 10 to 15 years because we focus so heavily on academic. Things like innovation, things like 3D reasoning, being able to touch a material and understand things like tactility are really important. And I think once we start to get those skills back and we create space within that, which I know is very crammed time frame that we have in school, I think it will make more rounded students as well, because they'll have a balance of things like academia, art, physical skills, sports.
We could probably do another podcast on this, on education. My role is actually, so my title is Applied Sport Management Lead. So mine is all about developing experiential learning within sport management. But realistically, we only have me leading a module on it, whereas the rest of it is academic. There's a few streams that we push this experiential side through, but it was seen as quite innovative 5 or 6 years ago when I came to Loughborough to try and develop this. So I'm definitely preaching to the converted, definitely lots more practical should be developed within education.
I was just going to say, I mean, I kind of just think about my career, and I did 2 textile A-levels. And if I hadn't had that opportunity, or I hadn't had a teacher that believed in me, I wouldn't be where I was now. My dad was always like, can you not be a lawyer or something like that? Get a good job. And I was like, I've traveled the world with my job. I've been quite successful in what I've done because somebody believed in me and because I had that opportunity at school and I had the resources to be able to do that. I don't know if I was in education now, if I would have those same resources, or if they would be prioritized. And if you're not academic, if you're neurodiverse, your strengths might lie in other areas. And kids don't always get those areas that are nurtured. We've had cuts to things like the arts. If we look at things like music, for example, it's not prioritized within school. So it's not necessarily just skills. It's a lot of the academic subjects just get squeezed in terms of time because schools are really pushed for those results in terms of things like math, science, English.
Well, we're not going to go into detail now, but I can't resist. And so in terms of the diversity side of things, we do tend to produce very similar students and very similar outcomes from our educational system. I'm not speaking Loughborough there, I'm talking GCSEs, A-levels, going down that road. I've experienced it with certain students in the past where actually when I'll say, we want you to be innovative, I want you to think differently. And it takes them a while to go, what, I'm allowed to give my opinion? Yeah. Do you know what? I'm often wrong and I'm teaching you things. So do it, please. And it gives a lot of confidence. It takes time to give them confidence for them to be able to start doing that. And that's probably one of the roles that I take on here. But yeah, we certainly need to see more of that.
Yeah, and you have to create a safe space for people to feel that they can be vulnerable and that they can be different and they can get it wrong. I'm a very proud dyslexic, and I think that's part of my success because I do think differently. I'm often the person who, says something off on a tangent in a room and they're like, yeah, we've never thought of it that way before. And I'm very proud of that because I think diverse teams have better ideas. Mono thinking teams end up in an echo chamber, and we really have to create the space and the culture to promote that within schools and within organizations.
Definitely. And I think it brings it back to what we're talking about here, because we need change. We need to do things differently. And we've talked about the kind of life cycle or circular design and different ways of doing things to reduce travel, reduce the use of certain materials, to reduce carbon footprint. All those things need to be done differently. So we need this difference. So just thinking about that, have you got any examples from either grassroots or professional clubs that are thinking differently, who are doing some really good things in this space?
Yeah, and I would just kind of say one other thing. It's about leadership. You have to have that diversity and that innovation at leadership level to be able to drive these ideas through. And I think, that can be missing. But I think there's a lot of different example of people who are thinking differently. Sail GP, for example, they launched recently performance wear that was made out of merino wool. So rather than using polyester, they really challenged technically what could be done with different materials and made a big release about that. And I think that is something that we need to see more of. We've had big events such as the Olympics where brands such as Nike will use that as an opportunity to really kind of talk about things like their recycled materials or what they're doing in terms of sustainability. But I think there's much further that we need to go, in terms of standout brands, a lot of the brands who are really making a difference are potentially the smaller brands who can be more dynamic, who can be more innovative, who can be quicker, and aren't accountable in the same way to shareholders. So one of them that comes to mind is a brand called Lacuna. They make a cricket kit for women, and they're the first brand ever to do that for women, which if you think in 2024, that's a ridiculous statement in itself,
Yeah.
that most cricket wear has generally been designed for men. But, they've really gone into their supply chain to understand what material should we make this from? How can we extend the product life of this? What are we going to do in terms of take back schemes when the player no longer needs this? They've also done things like supporting education around kit and equipment, about longevity, but also around things like safeguarding, for example. So I think we need to kind of learn the lessons also from those small dynamic brands as well as the big players, because potentially they're the ones who are the disruptors who are going to start changing the game. And there are things around different uses of integrating tech, for example. So there are companies who are offering buyback values to garments. So, for example, when you buy a garment potentially from a sports brand, they will give you a guaranteed buyback price so that you know that you can resell it for a certain amount. So I think things like that are quite interesting. And then also you have companies such as Connected Fanatics who aim to basically decouple the physical product from economic growth. So you buy one shirt, but that shirt will provide you with multiple digital experiences. So it has a chip embedded, and through that chip, you can access unique digital events, experiences, and that is a new way to engage fans. So there's a lot of innovation that's happening. I think it just takes leadership who are willing to drive kind of the unknown, and to take that risk and to think about future-proofing themselves. We're going to be living in a completely different world in 5 to 10 years. You have to be starting now to be able to create the structures to safeguard your organization.
There's a lot of good examples there, and later on we'll touch upon, is it Reading? I think you've mentioned me before around the climate change banner that they have.
Warming stripes,
yeah, that's the one, the warming stripes. We'll move on to talk about fans shortly. I think you mentioned some grassroots things to me in the past as well around cricket and the use of cricket equipment specifically. Can you just touch upon that for us?
Yeah, so I have done quite a lot of research on cricket. One of the case studies that we did with Yorkshire Cricket Foundation and the Centre for Sustainable Design was to look at reuse within the UK. So what tends to happen is most of the kit and equipment that is donated ends up overseas. A lot of it is shipped to Africa. But when you do that, it incurs things like carbon emissions. But you also have to be very careful in terms of your due diligence of what happens to that product when it gets to Africa, for example. How do you make sure that it is used by the players? How do you make sure that it continues to have longevity and doesn't break, for example, as when it gets there? And what I found was that there was an attitude that there was a greater need abroad than there is here. And then I talked to Kendall from Yorkshire Cricket Foundation, and she said there's a massive need in the UK. And she understood that need because she was very close to the stakeholders that she worked with. We talked to schools who said that they couldn't afford to teach cricket because it was too expensive. They couldn't afford to buy the kit. So what she did was to start a reuse program, and people would donate a lot of items. You had a lot of people who had stuff sitting in their garage as stored waste, and they donated it so that it enabled new players to enter the game. And at the time we did the research, there was a lot of press around the lack of diversity within cricket, the barriers that exist. And if you think it can cost about £1,000 to cut out a new player, that is prohibitive to most people, and a lot of people just wouldn't even be able to try out whether they liked the game or not because they couldn't afford the protective equipment. If you reduce that financial barrier, you encourage more people to play, you get the social benefits of playing a sport, and it's better for the sport long term because, you'll grow the skills and get better players. So what we found is that actually within the UK, there is a huge need, and potentially we don't always identify or understand the needs that are on our doorstep. And in very low cost and even no cost ways, we can create that infrastructure of reuse, around the club to break down those barriers.
I think there's lots of my friends who used to play cricket, and I imagine their garages are full still trying to, live the dream that one day they might go back. So yeah, get those things out your garages and actually give them to people, make use of them would be a good message to have. We'll draw to a close fairly soon, but I wanted to touch upon fans and participants. So we've looked at UEFA, we looked at professional clubs and brands and those kind of things. But what kind of impact do we as fans or participants have, and what can we do to help kind of facilitate change?
I think fans have a massive role to play. They are the reason why the game exists most of the time, but they also have a huge amount of power in terms of what they consume. And my advice would be buy what you love. So if you really want to support that club and you want to buy the shirt, do that, but continue to use that shirt for its full life. Do not feel the need to buy a new shirt every season. There are other ways that you can support your club, through things like ticket prices, things like that. But I think just because we're marketed product each season, we don't need to fall into the trap of buying it. And I think the most power fans can have is to decide where they spend their money and what they decide to buy in relation to merchandise. Yeah, I think that it's quite a simple message, but when we live in an era of overconsumption, actually just being really conscious about how and where you're spending your money, I think is really key.
I think I like simple messages. And I know Mark Doidge works on this kind of presumption that fans have that power to make change. And if we can start to make different choices, or maybe it is apply pressure back onto clubs and national governing bodies, then they will change because we are them. So I think those simple solutions, such as, well, maybe buy a kit every other year for your kids, or maybe buy something different that you can wear forever, is a much better choice for you and for the club. I think they're key things to make a difference. I think as well, with Grassroots, we all need to make these kind of decisions ourselves. So you mentioned it to me before around just say no to that free T-shirt potentially, and maybe people will stop doing it so much. My drawer's full of free T-shirts. I've worked in sport for a long time. But maybe we do need to start saying no to that, and maybe reducing the amount of time that it happens for. And also passing on kit to other people, whether that's, again, if it's kids football, the football boots. I know there's a lot of clubs now doing that, where they're recycling football boots, and maybe there's a contribution to the club, but the passing down of kit to other people, the sharing of cars, all these conscious decisions that we can all make can make a huge difference. And that the power of the fans or the participants is huge, because the people above us will change their behaviors based on ours. And we seem to think the other way around at times. And I think we do have so much power for change.
100%. And I think in some of the work that Mark has done with Pledge Ball, they found that it only takes between 20 to 25% of people to actually create a tipping point to make change. So I think if we can keep it simple and just buy what we love, but really utilize that product, that is one of the most powerful things that we can do. That will have such a huge knock-on effect. And like you say, just do you really need another race T-shirt? If it's just going to sit in your drawer, if Martin, if you're wearing those race T-shirts every week, happy days to you. But if they're just sat there, I would kind of encourage you to kind of say, well, do I need this next time? And when you sign up to a lot of events now, like the London Marathon, I think does it, the Manchester Marathon does it, they will give you an option to opt out, and some people will say, actually, I'll just have the medal instead of the race T-shirt. I want to have something to commemorate this, but I don't need both. And I think we need more of those like opportunities to actually say no. And I think governing bodies have the responsibility to make it easier and more convenient for us to say no to the things that we don't want.
I definitely think they do. But the more we can apply that pressure, I think they will start to make those decisions that are probably the right ones, not only for the planet, but for profit and for people as well. It kind of links it all back together where we started, really. Just kind of drawing to a close, really. It's been really nice speaking to you and getting a real understanding of the problem with the fashion industry, just highlighting some of that to us, where sport contributes to this. Some of the big headlines of, 60% of the kit not being used, it's getting incinerated, even in the UK. All of the recycling of things that reusing of things that get sent to different countries, a lot of it's not being used, it's being dumped, it's being burnt. So we really need to reduce our consumption of these goods. It'll be interesting to see the changes that clubs make and brands and manufacturers in how they start to change the way that they produce these goods. And I think that the kind of Scope 3 emissions piece will be a really interesting phase moving forward, looking around legislations. But I think kind of finishing the fans and the role that we play in consumption. One of the things stuck out, and I wrote it down here, around being a leader. You gave an example earlier about somebody in their environment, well, nobody's doing this, so I'm just going to do it. It'd be great for people to, you know what, actually, we need to start stepping up and making some differences to this thing. So it'd be amazing to see people take that on board and really go, yeah, there's no recycling or there's no reuse in my club, or the recycling's not very good. And just to take some responsibility and build a network of people around the country who are trying to make these changes. And as you mentioned there, and from the pledge ball and the behavior change, 20% of people. So just 2 out of 10 of you start doing it. And all of a sudden, lots of people will start doing it. I think that's a good message to end on, really.
Definitely. And most reuse organisations are led by individuals based on passion and purpose. And we'll put a list in the show notes. But it does just take somebody to stand up and say, we can make a difference. We can do it a different way. And I would encourage everybody to do that. We all have the power to do things differently.
Thanks, Jo. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm sure as your research continues, we might have to get you on again and when we start digging a little bit deeper.
Definitely. I'm sure this is something that's going to grow and grow over the next couple of years.
It certainly is. Well, thanks again, Jo.
Thanks, Martin. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.